Some things further on John's Gospel and the Gospels in general. You may notice, and lots have noticed, and it's been well written on, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke follow a very similar pattern with similar stories. However, modern scholarship wants to talk about their sources, and they must have had Matthew and Luke must have had Mark, and then some other source unique to them, and another source that was just the sayings of Jesus. And all of this was worked out, and it must be true because they were so certain of themselves, and they are because they tell us so in the 19th century, and this must have been the way that it was really done. This is not in accordance with how the accounts are from the early church, but nevertheless, all this to say, John's Gospel is very different. Now, some of the things that we might think with regard to John's Gospel is though John's Gospel is very different, it certainly isn't counter to what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling us. There are some things about John's Gospel that this writer, whoever he is, seems to know a little bit more about details of how life was in Galilee, and certainly more details about who's who in the high priest's family in Jerusalem. And we'll be getting to those readings coming very shortly. One of the things that John lifts up are signs. Now, in the other Gospels, we hear them as, or we read them as miracles. But John lifting up signs, we might want to take care to look at what John calls signs, and we might want to read signs rather than just miracle stories in the other Gospels as well. When Jesus performs a sign, look at the setting. And it's very similar to like Matthew, Mark, and Luke with the feeding of a multitude. We might want to think about bread in the wilderness like in Exodus and in Numbers. Jesus' signs and his sayings, Jesus has a lot of I am sayings in the gospel. That I am is not what we would usually see in grammar in Hebrew or Aramaic, because it is very like the name of God that God gives to Moses at the burning bush. So when Jesus goes to the festival of the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem and says, I am the light of the world, that dedication was the festival of Hanukkah, and the lights, given that they had lamp more and to spare, even though they thought it was only going to last one night for the lamp of the presence, it lasted 8 days until they could get more oil into Jerusalem, and you read about that in the book of Maccabees. But nevertheless, Jesus is making the bold statement that he is the light. When Jesus says, your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and died, and says, I am the bread of life, he's making it clear that who he is and what he offers is greater than what God gave Moses in the wilderness. So I think in reading the differences in John's Gospel, you might want to think of them as different scenes, and then pay attention to where Jesus is, where he's standing, and what he's saying. Now, there's no establishment of what we call the Lord's table or the institution of Holy Communion in that upper room in John's Gospel. He washes the disciples' feet. But certainly, as we have read John chapter 6, that in order to have part with Jesus, you must eat his body, and that his body is bread indeed, and drink his blood. We all, and the early church would think immediately of Holy Communion. Nevertheless, in that upper room, Jesus is saying that he has come to serve, and as Jesus is served, so also we ought to serve one another. and we can think about what God has done for us in the memorial of his giving his very body and blood for us, and how, yes, we're unworthy to receive that, but it is God's gift, and yet we must also welcome other people to receive as we have received. So as Jesus serves, so also we must serve. So they tie together wonderfully well, if you're reading them as they tie together wonderfully well. If you're reading them to separate everything out, to argue with one another in order to say that, this must be made up by one writer or another, by different sources with different messages, well, you can do that too. But pay close attention to where things are happening and how they parallel exactly what God had done for Israel. God fulfills God's promises to Israel. And we can see how Jesus, his very self, embodies all that God promised and did and accomplished through Israel in his own self. And while Israel often failed, Jesus does not. While Israel often gave in to temptation, Jesus does not, and brings us complete victory and new life in him. I hope this is of some help, as we are soon going to be finishing the gospel readings. And notice in our calendar of readings, we go into Acts. And so, the good news of Jesus Christ continues through the works of God's people. And this is still true today. Continue to pray for the direction of the church, that we indeed fulfill Christ's command of love and of service. Thank you very much. God bless.